Good evening, good evening, good evening. It's Max with Lunar Replicas, and I'm wishing you all a very pleasant and safe and peaceful President's Day evening. This is now about 10:40 on the East Coast here, and I don't know. Today I had this moment of sort of nostalgia, and wanted to know if if anybody else was interested in talking with me or just joining and chatting about the um, the history of NASA as it relates to the presidents that were involved in its conception, in its execution, um, for better or for worse, over the years. Um, Really focusing on that early period, um, and of course, being the diligent member of society and corporate America, I put together a PowerPoint. Um, but anyway, this is going to be relaxed. If anybody's interested, has any questions, I am not a presidential expert. I am a NASA historian in many ways, self-taught, and certainly read a lot about things over my lifetime, and I've been involved in a lot of this for the last 6 or 7 years, and then kind of been around it for a lot longer. So without further ado, um, I I'm, I've thought a lot about this, and thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we discuss, the foundation of NASA and the early programs as it relates to presidents. So a conversation on presidential role in early NASA history, President's Day 2025. Throughout history, there have been, throughout the early history, there was, those rocky starts and difficult things going on in the world, specifically, the space race and the Cold War, Vietnam, and later on, other conflicts throughout the 70s. And of course, things going on 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. It's not been an easy ride for NASA, but despite all of it, it has made it through. We've accomplished so much, despite hardships along the way. And really, it started with Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th president of the United States, served 2 terms, 1953 to 1961. His vice president was Richard Milhouse Nixon. That name sounds familiar, doesn't it? And in 1958, specifically on July 29th, he created a civilian agency, having had started NACA. NACA was the precursor to NASA. So this is now the non-military space activities, and specifically, it was in response to Sputnik. October 4th, 1957, Sputnik launched, and it was a surprise to the world. I mean, even in Russia, it was held pretty secret. It ignited that space race, and everybody was very familiar with Sputnik. It was a craze. I mean, this is really a we don't know what's going to happen. And Sputnik was up there for several months, I think almost a year. During that year, Eisenhower signed the HR 12575, the National Aeronautics and Space Act. And this is the actual language of it. And I'll read it now. The enactment of this legislation is an historic step, further equipping the United States for leadership in the space age. I wish to commend Congress for the promptness with which it has created the organization and provided the authority needed for an effective national effort in the fields of aeronautics and space exploration. The new act contains one provision that requires comment, yada, 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 so on and so forth. The present National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, with its large and competent staff and well-equipped laboratories, will provide the nucleus for the NASA. The NACA has an established record of research performance and of cooperation with the armed services. The combination of space exploration responsibilities with the NACA's traditional aeronautical research functions is a natural evolution. The enactment of the law establishing NACA in 1915 proved a decisive step in the advancement of our civil and military aviation. And the Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 should have an even greater impact on our future. So, July 29th, 1958, NASA began to exist. Directly as a result, after NACA, things that NACA designed are still in use. They did tremendous research on lifting bodies and designs for propellers and hulls and things like that. But now was NASA. The first administrator was Keith Glennon, Deputy Administrator Hugh Dryden. And this is the day they were confirmed here. Glennon on the right, Eisenhower in the middle, and Hugh Dryden on the left. And as an aside, the first NASA headquarters were actually the Dolly Madison House at 15th and H Street in Washington, D.C. Dolly Madison being when she resided in that house after being the widow of fourth President James Madison. And just as an aside, in 1961, the house was slated for demolition. And Jackie Kennedy actually saved it. And it is still there today. It's part of the, historic structures. So Project Mercury was birthed very, very soon after the announcement of NASA being started. And we all know these guys, the Mercury 7, on April 9th, 1959. So just a little while after the announcement, they presented the Mercury 7 here. Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, and Gordon Cooper here. That's from left to right. Wally's holding that rocket in a funny way. And this was the concept of the Mercury capsule. This is actually a graphic from 1959. It was a human-rated ballistic capsule launched by using existing intercontinental ballistic missiles. A scientific study of human physiology. They really didn't know what would happen to people in zero G, beyond some parabolic flights and things that pilots and military personnel had experienced in parabolic flight. The development of guidance systems and low Earth orbit technology, computerized systems, were very, very bulky and new, mostly mechanically driven. And computers were being used for range finding and target acquisition and things like that on battleships, and computer punch card systems for certain types of calculations and everything. But guidance and trajectories in space using the three bodies and all the other stuff that's involved in re-entry and trajectory was very, very new. Again, the only satellite that had gone up was Sputnik by the Russians, and even then, that wasn't really controllable. They threw it up there, and it had a antennas and a radio, but it wasn't really doing much other than up and orbiting. So everything was new, and they weren't sure how they were going to do all of it, which again gets back to who they selected. These guys were test pilots. They were military pilots. They were test pilots. They were people that were used to using technology that had never really been used before and learning on the fly, problem solving, and all that. Also helping with the design as well. A lot of these guys were, inherent engineers. Unfortunately, delays and just the nature of the program, Eisenhower didn't see the end of it. This was towards the end of his administration. Nixon ran against Kennedy in 1960, and John Kennedy won the election in 1960 and took office January 20th, 1961. Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Kennedy saw it through. The Mercury program had just done its first test flight as Kennedy was being inaugurated. A week or so later, Ham flew on Mercury Redstone 2, and then 5 months later, Alan Shepard launched on Freedom 7, Mercury Redstone 3. So this was, holdovers from the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy had just gotten there, and they were just able to launch uh, living objects, Ham and then Alan Shepard on a Redstone rocket, up and down 15 minutes. Gus Grissom's flight was not long after that either. But on May 25th, Kennedy addressed Congress saying that he wanted to double down and recommit to the resources of the space program, mentioning that they wanted to go to the moon. But it really wasn't until the September 12th, 1962, is about a year later, a little over a year later, the "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech at Rice University. That really solidified, we are going, this is start prepping for the Apollo program. And things started going pretty quickly after that. The Mercury program continued along with the 6 Mercury flights. Of course, the 7th would have been Deke Slayton's flight, but he couldn't fly. But over the course of the next 2 years, they were launching these and progressively adding to what, the capabilities of this program. Single man flights, orbiting, longer orbiting, and recovery, re-entry and recovery getting more and more accurate. They started adding more astronauts to the roles here. The astronaut group 2, the new 9, these guys: Neil Armstrong, Tom Stafford, Ed White, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Jim McDivity, Elliot C. Pete Conrad, and John Young. These guys became the core of everything that came next. The Mercury 7, not everybody stuck around. Of those 7, really only 3 or 4 of them stuck around, and actually 2 of the new 9 had been Mercury finalists. So Jim Lovell and Pete Conrad had been finalists. There might have been one other, I'm not sure, but I know for certain that Jim Lovell and Pete Conrad had been finalists in the Mercury selection. I think they were down to the last 13, and then out of that 13 they picked 7, and that became incidentally, the flight suit that Jim McDivitt is wearing in this photograph is in my collection. So what was Project Gemini? Gemini, and it was, by the way, pronounced Gemini. Gemini is the astrological sign. Gemini is how NASA personnel were told to pronounce the program. Expansion on Mercury. It was really, what are the goals that we need to achieve before we can look to the moon? And that was being up longer, orbiting longer, spacesuit testing, making sure that the spacesuits, which are themselves sort of a self-contained spacecraft, making sure that they can work in space and possibly on another surface. Rendezvous with 2 orbiting objects, being able to dock and maneuver and connect. You'd be able to connect hardware, hard docking, soft docking, and then, of course, accurate landing and recovery. If you can't get down or you can't pinpoint where it's going to land on Earth, then that's about 50%, and one of the most important parts, getting back home. As Kennedy said, returning safely to Earth, that was a key component of this. There was an idea that possibly we could get there and then not come back, or get there and stay there. A lot of permutations went through, orbital rendezvous and guidance systems, maneuvering, and then also, these EVA spacewalks. We'll get to the slide. We'll talk about that in the Apollo section. But so they selected a Titan rocket. This was really part of the Cold War. This is what we had laying around, were these amazing Titan rockets, and the one on the right is the Air Force's Titan, and the left is a Mercury or a Gemini Titan with a human payload. They are payload delivery of 8,000 pounds. So really just sort of a command and service module, not much more than that. Really just a test bed using equipment that was on hand. And boy, did they launch them. Astronaut Group 3, we're already bringing in more astronauts here. This is by October of 63. So now we're up to the third group of astronauts, another 14 astronauts. So now you've got 23 astronauts from the original 7, or plus some of the original 7 that were still sticking around. And Apollo really had already started. You don't really hear about this, but Apollo was already developing, coinciding with the Gemini missions, as early as 62, 63, they were already working on the Saturn V, the Saturn 1, the lunar module, and the command service module. The concept of the Saturn V was a 3-stage, heavy lifting craft that could move over 100 and almost 120,000 pounds of payload. And this is a concept from 1963 of what that would look like. So it's almost a fully formed thought. The same with the lunar module, and they were already building the structures and the infrastructure needed for this in Florida. They started by the middle of Gemini. They had already started moving some of the mission control and headquarters and stuff over to Houston as well. Johnson was involved in this all the way from the beginning. He was a senator during the Eisenhower administration and helped with the 1958 bill to approve NASA. So as the Senate Majority Leader, as a matter of fact. So this is, Johnson was involved in this. He wanted it to be in Texas. They put it in Texas. Rice University speech was in Texas. The vehicle assembly, or the vertical assembly building, at the time was the largest building by volume in the world when it was built. It is still, it's a gigantic building. I think today it's maybe like the third or fourth or something. Even still today, it's gigantic. And what was it for? It was for building. It was for assembling that Saturn V. You could assemble 3, possibly 4 at a time in the building. There were high bays for assembling these rockets, and they needed it. They were moving them that quickly. The Lunar Excursion Module, as it was called at the time, was designed entirely by Grumman. They were awarded the contract, and the concept, of course, being 2 vehicles going to the moon, having a separate lander, and then the ascent stage of that lander, is a relatively disposable lander, descent stage, the ascent stage, then coming back up to the command module. And they had already figured out, 3-man crews, 2 would go down, 1 would stay up. These were, they had tried different concepts. This seemed to be the best. And that's why Gemini was working so hard on orbital rendezvous. That was one of those, stepping stones along the way. And here we see actually one of the first tests of the Saturn 1 on October 27th, 61. They're already moving along with these, very quickly with the Saturn development. So this is happening even before the Gemini program really took off. Before they were doing active flights, they were concurrently working on Apollo. And really in January of 64 was the first time that the Block 2 Saturn 1 had overtaken the Soviet Union's capability. And President Kennedy visited, as that Block 2 was on the pad, Kennedy visited on November 16th, 1963. And unfortunately, about a week later, President Kennedy was assassinated. So on November 22nd, we all know what happened in Dallas, and Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in immediately as the 36th president of the United States. So all of this that led up to that moment, one of the last acts that President Kennedy did, unaware, obviously, that it was going to be one of his last acts, was to visit the Cape Canaveral and the Space Center there while they were looking to push these rockets. It was a major aspect of his presidency was to do a peacetime science-based push towards space. Personally and psychologically, it was good for the country going through Vietnam and a lot of other civil rights issues that were happening at the same time, or beginning to happen. The space race was incredibly important, and it was relatively a peacetime endeavor. And the fact that he pushed it so hard was something that was seen as a sense of pride. And fortunately for the space program, President Johnson, sworn in again on November 22nd, finished out Kennedy's term and was then reelected in the 1964 election and served a full term from 65 to 69. And he kept this going. He significantly kept the space program going. There were 10 flights of the Gemini program. Gus Grissom and John Young flew on March 23rd of 65. And each concurrent Gemini flight did the same thing that Mercury did. They were testing each thing. They were quickly moving towards the next goal: orbital rendezvous, EVA, station keeping, and attaining higher and higher altitudes. Gemini 11 used the thrusters on the Agena to help them achieve the highest apogee of an orbit possible at the time. The longest duration flight at the time, a Gemini 7 with Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, it was 2 weeks in 1965, December of 1965. They they were proving along the way all of this was possible. In fact, they went farther. 2 weeks was the longest duration. An Apollo flight would never have been 2 weeks. It would have been 7-8 days at the most. 6 to 7 days at the most, but they proved they could even live in space for 2 weeks, and the equipment would work, and they'd be able to get back down. And once again, delays and just how long things take with engineering. Johnson didn't get to see the fruits of his labor. Richard Milhouse Nixon was elected the 37th president of the United States in 1968. Johnson did not seek re-election, and Nixon ran. The 68 election actually is really interesting. I won't go into it, but it's something that's fascinating, where a third party, an independent party, really made a difference in this election, and significantly changed the outcome of it. Also a president who withdrew after during the Johnson withdrew after a few of the primary results came back in. Vice President Gerald Ford was Nixon's vice president, and within short order, the rest of the Apollo program continued under Nixon. So Apollos 9 through 17 were in the Nixon administration. And again, for better or for worse, the Nixon was a proponent of continuing this. He actually made sure to go to Apollo 11 recovery ship, the USS Hornet. He had a live telephone call with Apollo 11 while they were on the surface of the moon. It was something that he thought was important to be a part of. Whether it was just for publicity and to get people to like him, uh, you know, who knows? But the end result was they continued the program at least through 14. By 1970, there was already talk of reducing the number of Apollo missions. They were supposed to go through till 20. Apollo 13 had the accident, and in 1970, it started to become sort of problematic with a budget, a fiscally conservative president facing other issues as well, trying to draw us down out of Vietnam. The war was getting very costly and, costing lives as well as money. Nixon really wanted to start being more fiscally responsible with some of this stuff, or, so he said. And the program started to get put well on hold. And he was aboard the USS Iwo Jima on April 17th to see the Apollo 13 crew return safely. Let me back up for 1 second here. So there was actually I'll continue. So part of Apollo was the Skylab program. Skylab was sort of the remnants of Apollo. They used Apollo hardware to the Skylab station itself was made out of the second stage of a Saturn V. It wasn't completely purpose-built station. It was launched. It was the last launch of a Saturn V, actually, was Skylab 1, which brought the station up. And then Saturn 1s brought the crews, the 3 crews of Skylab 2, 3, and 4 to the station. One was a repair mission, and anyway, long duration flight, permanent home, orbiting laboratories and things like that. There was a proof of concept of some of that. The Russians had already started, putting in stations, longer duration flight with their Soyuz, and I believe they had a space station at the time, a smaller station prior to Mir. Mir was a little bit later. But this was what was left sort of the Apollo program. They had canceled Apollos 18, 19, and 20. This is what was left. And also here, this is a concept drawing of what Skylab was. A telescope, a workshop, several other, test beds inside long duration flight. The Apollo-Soyuz test project was also one of these leftovers of the Apollo program. They, again, took a little bit longer than expected, but they did think they could do it in 75. It was continued, but it was conceived in 72. So in 72 was really when the Space Task Group decided on, they recommended several suggestions for Nixon to continue the space program, and they were pretty ambitious. And really, the only thing that survived was the space shuttle. There was going to be longer duration lunar missions, continued lunar missions, a lunar base. All of that was scrapped. The only thing, it took 3 years, and he announced, or just under 3 years, and Nixon announced in 72 that the shuttle program was greenlit and pretty much everything else was canceled. Again, Apollo-Soyuz was allowed to continue because it was using older hardware, and really, the docking module was the only thing that was new in this project, and that was significant because the androgynous docking collar, which was a requirement that they actually go into very, very nicely in the TV series For All Mankind. The Russians didn't want one They didn't want their craft being the receiver of an American craft versus the other way around. Like it was, they couldn't agree on that, so they created it was political tensions design, which affected the design of a docking collar, and it worked. Actually, they made it work. They designed around it, and it was a non-gender specific docking collar, whole docking system that was still used. And again, Nixon resigned in 74, in August of 74. So this was seen through by Gerald Ford as the next president, as he took over the rest of Nixon's term. And this was not an insignificant mission. It's somewhat been forgotten about, but it was the first time the Soviet Union and the United States had really worked together on anything, and it was somewhat symbolic. But the stuff that came out of this mission, the lines of communication and the working together, was not insignificant. As a matter of fact, General Stafford, Tom Stafford, the commander of Apollo-Soyuz, also Deke Slayton, by the way, who hadn't been able to fly. Deke was a Gemini Mercury astronaut, one of the Mercury 7. He stuck around as the head of the astronaut office through the Apollo program. Deke finally got to fly in space. He had waited since 1959, and he finally got to do it in 75. So that's patience. General Stafford stayed in touch with the Russians and helped in a lot of ways that people don't realize. Russian, Soviet, then Russian relations and the United States for decades after Apollo-Soyuz. He was a conduit and a trusted, on both sides, trusted conduit for information and suggestions and stuff. Also, General Stafford, Tom Stafford, was a real badass. We just lost him last year. But he's one of those guys that nobody knows about. Like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like they don't really, they know him for going to the moon and being an astronaut and all this stuff. But what he did for the Air Force and for the United States cannot be understated. I mean, he literally wrote on a cocktail napkin the requirement specs for like the B-2 bomber. He was a real general that saw a lot of things through on time and on budget or under budget, in the government, which is like unheard of. But anyway, Apollo-Soyuz this was the end of the Apollo program. I mean, this is the last piece of the Apollo program. The Skylab was intended to be reorbited by the shuttle program, but shuttle had a lot of delays, and eventually it crashed into Australia. Skylab came down over the Pacific, and it happened to hit parts of Australia, unfortunately. But it was a great mission. And again, what was left of the speed at which Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were moving slowed down quite a bit under Nixon, towards the end of Nixon and Ford's administration. Things slowed down. The pace really slowed down, unfortunately. Shuttle, once into the 80s, picked up quite a bit, but there wasn't a specific mission through the 80s until the late 80s when a space station was envisioned. And having this quickly reusable launch system was what was capable of building that station, albeit a lot slower, because they didn't have as heavy lifting capability as they would have if they had kept the Apollo program going, or had come up with another heavy lifting rocket like the Saturn V. So things slowed down. Space Shuttle had many, many successful missions, but really it was towards the end of the Nixon administration that we saw a slowdown in the pace that had been started by Eisenhower, continued through Kennedy and Johnson, um, finalized under Nixon, and then, you know, pretty well slowed down by then. What came next, however, was extraordinary. It just took a little bit longer. The International Space Station was built, operational as of 2000, and of course added to over time. Um, the next steps along the way, you know, there were other Hubble and the other satellites and things that went up that were deployed by space shuttles. The maintenance that was performed by shuttles, the continuing that international relation as well. International Space Station was developed by ESA and the European Space Agency, by the Canadian Space Agency, the Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, the post-Soviet era space agencies, which are still involved today. And you know, they talk about some of these astronauts are training and living amongst people who are, you know, not friendly nations with each other, but they work together on the International Space Station. It's really a wonderful project for that. There are some tensions and stuff, but generally this has been an ongoing cooperative project for 25 years. Similarly, the space shuttle program had a lot of cooperations, over 135 missions. So there was a lot of synergy there as well. Russia, of course, continued using the Soyuz and Salyut, I believe it is, the rockets, spacecraft. And today we're continuing along with the Artemis program. There's parts of that are being built by ESA. A Canadian astronaut will be in Artemis 2, and we've gone back to the moon on Artemis. So the uncrewed, but we were there in November of 22, and hopefully April of 26 there'll be Artemis 2, as we see here, will go back to the moon. So that's basically presidents throughout history and the space program, and how they affected it. You know, some of it was born out of presidents themselves, vice presidents. Like I said, Lyndon Johnson was a key person in the Senate in the 50s that helped Eisenhower make that possible. He was on the Armed Services Committee and had a lot to do with, you know, integrating the and justifying the costs involved in a space race that could also be used, you know, tangentially or directly used for weapon systems and military goals, as well as civilian goals and aeronautical goals. You know, these guys really made this happen. And for better or for worse, you know, we wound up with the program that we had. There might have been other steps along the way that could have expedited or made a more of an impact, or continued at the same speed and trajectory that we had in the 60s and early 70s. Certainly that 1969 Space Council report would have been amazing to see. I mean, that would have been one of those things that the TV series and fiction writers have been able to create a narrative to see what that would look like. For All Mankind is one of them. They basically said, here's our space economy. By the 70s and 80s, you know, what we're able to do now in the 2000s and 2020 teens and 20s, they were able to do in the 1980s. And honestly, that might have been the trajectory. Mars had been on the table at one point. Werner von Braun had wanted to go to Mars, use the moon as a stepping stone. Kennedy, I don't think Kennedy ever mentioned Mars necessarily as a real possibility, but it would have been interesting to see again what that trajectory would have been. The Nova rocket, I'm not certain on the Nova rocket, frankly. You could, Sean asked a question here, is how far along was the Nova rocket before cancellation? I see development documents, quite fascinating. I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, there was also like the Sea Dragon, it was a concept of a heavier lifting rocket that could be launched from the ocean rather than a pad, which might have helped, some of the difficulties, of course, also launching or leaving from Earth orbit, having a more stable platform in Earth orbit to then go beyond, getting off Earth is more than half the battle. That's why Saturn V is so big. But assembling a craft in space and then taking off from there, having sort of a gateway in orbit, which is something that's being developed now as part of the Artemis program. There is a gateway station that is designed to be orbiting the moon, which we can use for other projects, farther out, or satellites and research stuff happening, launching from space rather than from Earth. Imagine that, developing or building, especially with like 3D printing technology and manufacturing remotely, being able to build something completely in space and launching it from there. I think they're kind of doing that with cube satellites on the space station now. But imagine if we were able to do that in 1985. Where would we be now? This 40 years later, where would we be at this moment? Again, that trajectory. I keep getting back to the trajectory. And I think that's really where the presidents came in. The presidents made that trajectory. Eisenhower came in and wanted us to be competitive against the Russians, to be, he knew, having worked with the Russians during the Soviets during World War II, he knew they were forced to be reckoned with, and this was something that was important. Kennedy wanted to make sure we caught up and had this, leapfrog to get to the moon, and Johnson continued that, and Nixon continued some of it, but was focusing more on Earth. Have satellites and have a low Earth orbit, reusable, fiscally responsible rocket system, spacecraft system, which became the shuttle. Again, the shuttle had been conceived in the 60s under Kennedy and Johnson, but it was not a serious contender until we had completed the goals of the Apollo program, and even then, there were missions that weren't really discussed publicly, that were Air Force missions of reusing Gemini hardware and possibly some Apollo hardware to complete Gemini, or to complete Air Force related missions. NASA also did a bunch of stuff with space planes and delta wings and things like that. That research became part of the selection of the space shuttle design. So yeah, the president has a significant role to play in this, if not directly, then certainly indirectly as a supporter of a particular goal and speed at which that goal should be attained. And I think that we'll see what that looks like. The shuttle program was ended in 2011. There really hasn't been a replacement for the shuttle since. There's been a couple of starts and stops with different systems. Artemis is the best bet now for quite a bit of that. And of course, the private sector has taken a lot of the slack up for where the United States hasn't developed as much because of various reasons. We live in a world that is much more connected and participatory, by other countries. We are relatively peacetime, the longest stretch of peacetime, knock on wood, in most of human history, at least modern human history. And there's other people that have taken up the slack there. The Indian space program, the Chinese space program, ESA, Canada, the UK, I don't think has much of a space program, but I know they support, NASA and everything. Actually, our own during the Apollo program, we had British people involved, but I'm not sure if they were directly, John Hodge, for instance, was not. I don't think he was on loan from the UK. I think he was a expat that lived in the United States. Yeah, no, we are an internet. I mean, this is really a global effort now, and it should be seen that way. I think this is human advancement. It's not, nation state advancement. This is these are things that the application of the discoveries and science that comes out of it, the technology that is developed for these programs, are beneficial to everybody. Shouldn't necessarily be hogged by one country. And I think that, the "we came in peace for all mankind" is might not have been 100% true in 1969. It wasn't really for all mankind. It was really kind of for the United States, but it could have been. It could have been for all mankind. And today we can certainly make it that way, and that would be a good goal for everybody. Whether we have people in place, leaders that want to do that, want to continue that, don't know. I'm not here to say. I'm not an expert on that. But again, thank you everyone for joining. Hi, Jay, Jonathan. Nice to see you guys. Thought this was an interesting day to discuss these guys and how they impacted the space program. So I hope everyone had a nice President's Day, safe. It was windy here. It was unbelievably windy. I saw there was another aviation accident, but fortunately, I believe everyone survived. I hope everyone was okay. Seems to be some bad luck going on right now with aviation, unfortunately, but hopefully we can turn that around pretty quickly as well. In any case, everyone have a very nice week, and maybe we'll do another one of these soon again. Talk to you soon. Bye.